All right. Now
That it's a miracle. Hey, listen, thanks everybody for giving us a little bit of time to scramble around. And thanks for the friends I see in the channel that helped us get there. So I'm going to spend the next, I think we're a bit behind schedule. I'm not sure, but I'm going to try to clip through and give you a brief tour of my my thoughts on how to talk to your boss. Actually, not my boss, because he knows about open source, but in general, just trying to provide some ideas for folks who are thinking about approaching people that may not be familiar with open source for a range of reasons. It's going to be sort of top level, and let's go. Now, I'll just warn you, there's a lot of words on my slides. I'm not going to be reading them, and I don't necessarily expect you to read them all too. But this is, part of my mission as an OSI board director to make sure we're doing education. And the idea is to leave that behind for self-exploration later too. And we'll share the presentation after the event with live links so you can peruse. So my very first conversation in public trying to explain open source was in an awkward moment when we were surprised by a bill being presented in the House of Representatives in the Oregon State Legislature in 2003. Now, it might be helpful just to take 2 minutes to explain how I got involved in open source. I was running a commercial ISP in Portland, Oregon, and became familiar with open source because in those days, ISPs were very raw. We didn't have any back office systems. And what we now call open source was really part of the commercially hardened infrastructure we used to run ISPs, things like mail and DNS and such. So I was confident that open source was a safe thing because I'd had that experience. And while I was still with the ISP, I had a 19-year-old self-taught Linux programmer that came to me one day and said, I got to show you something. It's so exciting. It's about 1995. So exciting. And it's called Linux. And it's going to light the world on fire. And I love it. And can I spend some time contributing to the project as part of my job? And so my first contribution to open source actually was telling a 19-year-old, yes, set him free to spend some time contributing. And that came in handy later. As I moved on, as that industry imploded in flames during that period of time, I ended up working for the state of Oregon. And I was the deputy CIO for the state of Oregon. And that's the part of my journey where I learned a lot about government. Someone did introduce, in fact, a bill to introduce open source. And no one had been talking about it in state government before that. Everyone looked at me and said, can you help? Part of my responsibility was to explain complex, expensive technology projects to the legislature. Now, we're talking about a legislature who didn't know the difference between a computer and a data center. And I sometimes had to spend time before sessions explaining what computer networks were. So this is not a super read-in audience to begin with. So imagine then something hits a legislature to mandate that state agencies use open source, and they didn't know what it was. And the observations and watching people painfully try to describe it was just something else. It included, probably my favorite story was someone from the open source community from, I think, the Portland Linux user group, tried to explain that open source was like an orchard where you could walk through the orchard and pick fruit. And one of the legislature looked at him quietly for a moment and said, well, son, where I come from, if you pick fruit out of someone's orchard, you're going to get a backside full of buckshot. So that probably was not the best analogy, but it did. I did start paying a lot of attention to how people use language and how they explained open source and what their motivations were. So that was my first conversation. By the way, and I'm going to mention this because I see Salona's with us, at the table, the lobbyists who were against any use of open source at the time were, of course, still Microsoft then. They still felt open source is communism. They come a ways. And IEEE's lobbyist was also there lobbying against the bill. But it wasn't really so much that we didn't want to use open source in government. We actually were, and I found that out, and that was part of my testimony. It was just a poorly written bill. And we've all grown along since then. So that's sort of my entree and how I got going. And at the time, Oregon, and it still continues to be really rich with open source communities, technology. And I had the benefit of learning from some of the best and most seasoned professionals in the industry. I went from state government to working at the open source lab at Oregon State University, and I really began to learn about communities. That's a picture from OSCON, which is now in the history books, but was held in Portland for a long time. It was an influential open source conference. That's a picture of Manuel Velardo, who ran the country of Spain's open source initiative. I've done some research for them. And also Ward Cunningham, my friend, who invented the wiki. And if you are involved in object-oriented programming, you'll probably recognize his name. So lots of deep discussion. Currently, I'm on a number of nonprofit boards, Democracy Lab, that connects volunteer developers with public benefit programs. The Open Source Elections Technology Foundation I've been with for some time, that's working on a national specification for open source voting, and has been instrumental in helping with some transparency issues and security in the election system. I am on the OSI board. This will be my last year. At the end of October, I will have been on the board for 9 years in 2 different pieces. It's been an honor, and I'm leaving happily with lots of great people behind to pick up the mantle, especially Stefano, who's our new ED. I also, representing Red Hat, but not on the other boards. I represent Red Hat on the Eclipse Foundation board, and I'm currently the leader of Red Hat's open source program office. So I want to give you some general ideas and my advice on how I've been able to best approach people in any situation, in any industry, in any scenario. These are sort of my basic guidelines. The first thing is I always make sure I understand what my own motivation is to have a conversation. You need to prepare that so you're square with yourself and so you can answer that question if it comes up. You also need to understand what's motivating the person that may be interested. It's hard to just do a pitch. You need to understand what they may need to be changing or what problems they're trying to solve. Also really important to know that you may not be the person who ultimately convinces them. That especially for people in government agencies and other leaders, they'll tend to want to hear from people who have walked in their own shoes, and the benefit of understanding who their peers are that have used open source, or where there are use cases of other like-minded organizations or nonprofits or businesses makes all the world in being able to create an opening for open source. And then, of course, one of my strongest recommendations is to just try to find as much objective information as you can. Research data, use cases for the industry are really helpful to have someone besides just you telling the story. I am not a systems engineer. I'm not even an engineer. So I can't have deep technical topics, conversations around the topic. And I have found for me, that's not what I really am helping with as much, but I am a student of systems thinking. And one of the heuristics that has really served me over the last, I'd say the last 20 years or so, is understanding this, that every technical project has 3 components. And technology is just one of them. There's also technology and financial and political. And sometimes that's political with a capital P, where it's public policy, and you need to move public policy to make a change or implement something. And then there's this lowercase p, which is people that are involved in making decisions and will move your project forward. And you need to be sensitive to the fact that who's involved in the decision making, and even how that'll influence the person who you're trying to persuade, to make sure they have the best information they have to be able to address the political pieces. It's these last 2 that have been my strength, and I'm really pleased to work with gifted people who have great technical projects to help them forward what they're doing from where I sit. So I'm going to go through, I'm just going to kind of clip through a few industries. I'm going to ask Deborah, the moderator, let me know what is our hard stop for time. Are we going, is this session running till 12:30? Anybody still here? Okay,
I'm here, Deb.
Yeah.
Let me check on that for you.
Would you? That would be great. I want to be very mindful because I know we might have started a few minutes late. I can catch
No
up.
problem.
All right,
One
so I'm
second.
going to no worries. So I'm going to clip through a couple of industries, and again, I'll tell you a couple of stories. I'll try not to make you read a bunch of slides. So if you're in private industry and you're trying to influence your company, your manager, maybe your peers in another department, there are a huge, I'm not going to go into any detail. There is a huge list of reasons why companies are moving to open source, depending on what industry they're in and what their motivations is. But understanding what that is, you may have your own, but really understanding what the company should be motivated to do becomes critical. Now, the reason that I have highlighted developer happiness and talent is because we're sitting in a moment in time where this is unusually important. All right, and that is thanks, Remy, and that is because we've all heard of the Great Resignation. People are unsettled and looking for things that make them happy. And globally, companies have moved in a world where a lot of us are working remote, where companies did not allow remote employment before. A lot of developers are rethinking what they want to do and how they want to work. So right now, a really important reason for a company to think about moving to open source is it's one way you can attract great developers, besides all the business reasons. I just wanted to highlight that. That's something that's especially true right now. I'm leaving behind some conversation starters, but I really encourage you to know that this may not be your first conversation, to be curious and listen well, and also don't just be the expert. Even if the person doesn't really know much about open source, no one likes to feel like they don't know anything. So ask questions that may give them an opportunity, or at least feel like they have an opportunity to weigh in and tell you what they know. If you work in the software industry, this was a fact that came out of a research that Red Hat had funded that I was not surprised, but surprised to see a bit, which was that when they interviewed 1,300 IT execs in industry, 83% of them said they were more likely to select a vendor who contributes to the open source community. That made my heart sing as a community member, but it's also an important fact if you're pitching open source and you're in the software industry and that's where your work is. But more importantly, go look for studies and research like this to help make the case to the folks that you're working with. So I think I made this comment. You just need to make sure it's aligned to the company's strategy. That will be more sustainable and fundable. So you get that technology, finance, and political piece. Nonprofits are by far a sector that are using open source more than, I see my colleague Heather Leeson's on the call. Open source is adopted so much by nonprofits, not just because it has shared values, but also because they'd rather spend the money on the mission and not the tools. Open source also has a broad community of contributors and volunteers. If you want to work with a nonprofit and you want to help them do more, they appreciate people from the community can help them evaluate replacement technology. If it's a larger nonprofit, OSI is an example where they use CMS as an open source platform, but they hire a contractor to help maintain it. In a smaller organization, you might even have a volunteer that's willing to do that. This has been important, but I did want to comment very briefly. There's a huge trend in philanthropic giving and infrastructure development. I've been very privileged to have been able to work with the United Nations 17 tables on their sustainable growth goals. And there are initiatives underway that are making it easier for philanthropic organizations to structure their funding around prioritizing open source projects and open IP, open standards. And I've listed a couple of these here and it'll be in my presentation for folks that are working in that space. For me, it's super exciting. The Digital Goods project that's producing a registry of open source projects viewed as public good is exciting. I just learned 2 days ago that the Fedora project's just been accepted to that list, so we're pretty stoked to hear that too. So what else do I want to cover? Public sector, there's just a ton we could unpack. I'm just going to throw a couple of ideas. Again, if you're working in the public sector, try to get to objective data. This is a case where an agency had a mission. The Department of Energy was told they needed to make sure that U.S. power plants were secure. They engaged a nonprofit to go to the university. I did research and interviewed folks that were doing nonprofit cybersecurity, open source security projects, put that together and help with federal funding. So there are great opportunities if you can just make sure you get to the facts. Also, here's a smaller government example. I was working with a city who really wanted to support open source communities, and I gave them a way to think about the benefit of open source, in particular for women. Petra's got a great story. She was making a mid-career change, and open source was a way for her to bridge and get to something else she enjoyed doing without going back to college. So there's a lot of stories like that, and we encourage those kind of initiatives. I'll leave behind some information on government operations. That's a huge thing, so I'm leaving behind some tips for anyone that wants to take that on. It can be done. Timing is everything. In academia, if you're a student, or if you're a parent that wants to see more curriculum, or if you're actually in faculty, there are so many examples and resources to draw from, and I'll leave a bunch of them behind. I worked at Oregon State University. We turned a hosting project into a teaching platform and a service to community. It was a public institution, so that was really part of our charge. The Rensselaer Center has set up an open source software center for students, for them to work on social innovation. So it's a great practice. RIT, I could spend a whole session talking what they've done there, but they offer a minor in open source. They have a great culture, and they also do things like encouraging students to contribute to humanitarian projects, to both do good things and also learn along the way. Another version of an adoption of open source in the academic setting is the UC Santa Cruz's Cross Center, and it's a postgraduate program where they're focusing on students being able to take open source projects and then convert them into something that becomes commercialized. And that was seeded by the idea of Ceph and Ink Tank. The founder, Sage Will, had graduated from UC Santa Cruz and helped seed the start of that foundation. And then, of course, I touched on this briefly, but I cannot tell you how important humanitarian open source software is in the context of academia. We've learned from sociological studies that young women prefer and are more drawn into engineering if they feel like the project they're working on has human benefit. And so that has been a great way, and I've talked with a number of campuses where they've seen an increase in the participation from their female engineers in courses that include that as a component of that. Also resources, and how are we doing on time? Remy, you've got to keep me true to our clock because I don't want to run this over.
We're getting close, Deb.
Okay, cool. I'll go 2 more slides and then we'll just see if there's any quick questions. Resources I would leave behind. There's a wonderful community called teachingopensource.org, where academicians are trading curriculum and best practices, and that's K-12. It's not just higher ed. So it's a super community. There's also a community called the Professor's Open Source Summer Experience, which is started as a Red Hat funded program, and today it's part of the it's underwritten by the National Science Foundation. It's an international group, and they help professors get comfortable with open source so that they don't feel like they're teaching something they have no idea. Apereo Foundation focuses on operations for higher ed. There are just so many things to do. My guidance always is to look for something in your educational institution you feel like you can build on. And there you go. There's a world tour of ideas across many industries.
Nicely done, Deb. Nicely done. Everybody give Deb a round of applause, especially for performing under fire.
Thank you very much. And thanks for the help in getting us online.
Good, good, good. All right, folks, go ahead and start putting your questions in for Deb in the chat. I'm going to promote Amanda to presenter so she can start uploading her slides, and hopefully we can do the speaker switch off a little more gracefully this time. Again, anybody who has questions or comments, we saw a lot of links in the chat for all the academic institutions. I'm a little biased having done work with many of them, but it's great to see those links there. Please share your favorite academic or other resource for helping talk to your bosses. I'm sure many of you have had to do that before.